Great, thanks Gemma, and hi everyone. It's really nice to be back here, and I forgot to tell Gemma that I'm visiting professor here at the university, which is a great honour, and but that means that people are going to get really sick of me soon, so it's great to be here, and particularly to talk about a subject that I've been interested in for a long time and have been actively doing work on, I suppose, for about 10 years in a more concentrated form. And the title here is Wise Owls Revisited, which is the title of a paper that we did nearly 10 years ago, in which we had involved older people in research, quite a very complicated project, and we wrote it up, the involvement bit, as being about wise owls and professors. So that was a contribution, and we were delighted it got published, and it still gets quoted, and that's great too. So as you can see, it's, I'm talking about involving older people in research, particularly research done on a professional basis. Obviously, lots of older people do their formal and informal research without the benefit of anybody being paid to do it. So I'm not concentrating much on that civic bit, although I think it's under-researched and provides great opportunities for different forms of research to take place. But I'm going to be talking about the sort of big business of research on ageing, and the ways in which involvement moves around and ideas change, and think about some of the ways in which they've altered over the areas that I've been working in. So I'm going to be thinking about how we engage older people in research at many levels. I'm going to give some examples with the whole range of generalities, but I can help people with the references to the examples if you wish. And I'm going to be, as I said, talking about one of the earliest projects we did, which was horrendously complicated, which was of the evaluation of the National Service Framework for older people in England. You may remember, it seems like ancient history now, that there was a whole spate of national service frameworks for older people, mental health, so on and so forth. And that was quite a fashionable policy way of doing things. And one of those was for older people, set up in 2001. And the Healthcare Commission, a body now gone, the Commission for Social Care Inspection, a body now gone, and the Audit Commission, a body now gone, commissioned us, which we're still around, to do the evaluation. And quite interestingly and innovatively, they wanted older people to be part of an evaluation team. And we did that. We enrolled a group of older people who'd been doing a course in research methods at the University of Lancashire with Roger Clough, and they were interested in forming a cooperative and to assisting research teams. And this, I think, was the biggest thing they'd ever done, and it was our major job of engaging with people who weren't research assistants, but actually contributed to the field work and had all sorts of adventures along the way, ranging from shoveling snow in car parks from great meetings to barricading their doors in a certain rather dodgy hotel because they were so scared of it, so were we, and ways in which we work together as a team. And I think we learned a lot from that, and it still resonates with me. And some of the older people who were on that project, a number of whom have died, so they were older people and weren't altogether well. And some of them we're still in contact with, and I think you're in this area for the long haul as well as the short. I'm going to be talking about the way we operate to things as a research unit, which is a choice which I've deliberately made, which is to have a standing older people's advisory group. We call it UserCarer advisory group because we're in the language of social care. But the way in which I think that's assisted us in threading through the work that we do, and particularly to think about ideas rather than different projects. If you lurch from research projects to research projects with different groups of advisory interests, you spend a lot of time and you reinvent the wheel. So this has been going since, I think about 16 years now, standing. They're probably sitting by now, like we all are. Some of the members are the same. Some of them have died. Some of them have decided they no longer want to come to meetings. But I think that's been particularly good in terms of an academic department in providing that nothing without us, about us without us mantra, in that if we have ideas, we can discuss them with people. If we have PhD ideas or new PhDs, they come and present to the group, and they see that as part of normal business. It's nothing special to involve older people, or indeed users and carers in other formats. And indeed, they often have things to say, and probably the most challenging moment that people get to is really saying what my project is about in lay terms to this rather critical group of people who are well used to our sort of airy-fairiness at times, and perhaps our lack of really making application to what it means in real lives. So we run a standing group. We try and persuade people to put biographies themselves on the unit, and so they're seen as full participants if they wish. And we hope that's had an influence in other groups as well, saying that you can involve people, not just a one-off, but really thread it through either your teaching or a research initiative, but not to do it one bit at a time. People are always trying to borrow the members of this group, so they sort of say, oh, couldn't they just come along and join our group? So I have to be quite protective of them and do things like that. But a number of them have done good things and been involved in other more highfalutin RCT studies, which we don't do a lot of, so they've skilled up in that way. Some of them have gone on to ethics committees or Health Watch, which is the sort of consumer group in our health service. So I think it has increased their confidence and their ability, and actually they are much needed on various groups. And we don't think it's any great magic art or anything, but occasionally we meet people who you say, do you involve users or carers or patients? And they say, oh yes, we've asked them to fill in a questionnaire. And you think, well, that isn't precisely the involvement we meant. So really the key question I think emerges now is not so much the values and the principles and the way in which people are generally okay about user involvement, and that I think has changed in the last 20 years, but particularly at times of austerity, about thinking about the cost issues and how you defend that, not when you're working with very large grants or research initiatives, but when you're dealing with quite small ones and you don't have a lot of money to throw in many directions. In England, Sky and NICE and National Institute of Health Research have done a lot of work through an organisation called Involve, which has talked about how to engage with people and payment mechanisms in that way. And we do pay our advisory group members for projects where we can, and we explain to them where we can, and we explain to them where we're doing it on a wing and a prayer, and actually it's more a hobby than a real job, and we just can't do it. And we hope that there's some checks and balances. And I suppose what we've learned is really being upfront about that. Money is good for some groups. If you get an NIHR grant, you can be giving good money to people, as well as their accommodation, which we often pay for people who come from the north of England, because coming on an early morning train to London is ridiculous. But we pay accommodation, we pay their costs, we pay carer costs and so on. You can do that with big money. Little money, you can't. So it's very important, I think, to clarify when you're moving from expenses to fees. We could save a lot of money just by having London older people involved in our research, because they all have a magic free transport pass now, and that has saved us a lot of money. But we don't want just to have London people, because they live in a particular bubble, so we do pay that way. And we're talking expenses being okay, fees negotiable depending project by project. If you're asking people to step up and maybe assist with being present at a focus group interview, or indeed in going into care homes to recruit, then again you need to think about, is that an expense or a fee or a combination of the two? And our university is obsessed with paperwork about involvement of that way, particularly around getting people's proof that they can work in the UK. I don't know if that is terribly important. But, and so every time I pay somebody something, I have to say that I've seen their passport. For some older people, they haven't got a passport, and that's very difficult. And you do need the admin support to run all this, or you need a really good assistant in research who will keep all that, because nothing is more tiresome than if you're having meetings and you're always asking people to bring their passport and photocopies and things like that. So getting those systems slick. University requirements are also increasingly very, very worried that people are being inventing themselves as self-employed when they're not self-employed. But I'm not going to employ somebody to come for a Friday afternoon meeting, whatever. So we do a bit of negotiation around that as well. And all these are very sort of very sort of minutiae things, but they take up a disproportionate amount of time, as everybody knows. Should we pay people for their involvement in a project, or do we pay them for activity? My view is that I pay a lot for people where I can to come to a meeting, but I expect them sometimes to do looking at documents, and I'm not going to pay extra for that. So, for instance, we might have a project setup meeting. People would be paid to give their views as older people on it, but I might then ask them to pay to look at the interview schedule. But that, I think, is, if you've explained that, that too is okay. And lastly, I suppose, how do we manage problems? Because all these things, when you hear other people talk about them, are always so good, aren't they? Everybody works well, there's no conflict, and things like that. And you think, well, surely in my experience, there always is. And there is, and I think that's part of the research task, isn't it? To make sure that you have a chair of the meeting, you have a facilitator, you're dealing with people who find it sometimes very hard to hear, and we have perennial problems in the university of making sure the hearing loops work and so on and so forth. But also to manage that way in which people need briefing and support before they come to a meeting, because perhaps they think they want to talk about their experience, and so by the nth time you've heard somebody's experience, you don't want that. Being more clear, I suppose, about what the expectations are, and managing problems, managing the people who dominate meetings by force of personality, or because they have a particular background in certain area, or because they've always been the person who's dominated discussions. We've found it quite difficult to persuade older people to be co-investigators. That's the people who fill in the forms and who have real legal responsibilities for the conduct of the research. It sounds great on paper. Would you like to be a co-investigator? Sounds, like coming to a party or something like that. But when you're saying to people, they will tick this box electronically, they will be there and responsible for certain things. My experience is that that's not everybody's cup of tea. A lot of funders love to see it, but I think that's people who don't always have a great deal of experience with researchers, and particularly groups for whom the legal niceties of research are not altogether things that they're comfortable with. So occasionally we might have people as co-investigators who have lay status, but there are also other roles that can be constructed for them if they don't want to take it on. Other groups would love the chance to be co-investigators or even principal investigators, but a lot of these grants nowadays are in open competition, and my experience is that rarely do people without the infrastructure of a university and a research track record stand much chance of getting the really big grants nowadays. So Sky and Involve publish shed loads of material on all this. I'm sure everybody's well aware. And I think they've been very helpful to people who are beginning their careers, and also to remind us, those of us who are at the end of them really, what to do about certain difficulties, certain differences, and so on, which helps there. So our experience of this standing group is about refreshing and renewing, and having conversations with people who perhaps begin to miss meetings but don't yet want to miss that social environment of a group. And it is an important group activity. People get Christmas cards, it's good, people are interested in them, it's a nice group to belong to. Managing withdrawal then, and inducting new people, because nothing's more scary than joining a group that's been going since 2002 or something and feeling you're the new person on the block. Our group now is quite old, and they're very feisty, I think is the word people might say. It's scary to join them and to be the new person on the block. How do you bring that in? And they have a lot of shared experiences as well. Many of them have been older people's activists, which is a very under-researched field, but older people's activists know a lot about local government, they know about departmental bodies, they know about initiatives that have come and gone, and they know a lot. To be a newcomer on that scene is sometimes quite difficult. We do manage the practicalities, and the way I do that, we do that in the moment, is that somebody runs the group, because if it's everybody's business, it's nobody's business, and people need to know who to contact. We do also extend other opportunities for people to get involved in things. If they're in London, there are lectures and seminars and events like that. But even outside London, linking people in with other activities, occasionally sending them documents saying you might have seen this or whatever. At least 2 members of our group do their own blogging, so they probably did it before the rest of us. They're very up on social media. They don't need, and they tweet as well and things like that. Some people, that is not their cup of tea. And some people, we send out the documents by the post rather than electronically, because that's not what their interests are. Increase other people, as I've said, are blogging and tweeting before you've turned your back on something. We have offered them opportunities for co-research, and I'll indicate how we've done that shortly. And then I suppose the other bit is ensuring that when people work with you and colleagues and the admin staff and people in finance know what's involved, what it means, they don't keep querying things and so on. And say we've got to make the most of such a resource, because it's really about impact, and it's about improving the quality of the research, which is always much easier to do if you say, well, I've gone through this document. And we all make mistakes in our documents, don't you? And you want a real person who's got the time and the ability to say, but you asked that question there and you've used the wrong tense here, and really great skills at doing that are terribly, terribly useful. And to think of new ideas, and just to say, particularly in England, things can be called different things in different places. We have something called self-directed support in some parts of England, which means absolutely what it means to others. Personalisation, personal budgets, all that sort of thing. Other parts of the country, they don't have it. Does not exist. They call it personal budgets, all that sort of thing. So enabling a wider group to explain, you might want to use different terms for different aspects. So here's some of the research realities that have been also indicative of how we've helped work with older people have helped us to work with projects. Often I think we're talking about interviews and focus groups when we're talking about older people's involvement, the ways in which they can assist with that particular method. It is a lot harder to get lay involvement, and particularly older people's involvement, or any involvement with something like a systematic review, isn't it? What do? You say, well, perhaps you'd like to look at 1,000 abstracts. No, thanks. No, please, no. And the systematic review is commissioned on a particular topic. It's not about tell me your experiences of challenging behaviour in dementia. It's about what is the crunchiness of the material say. We've found that very difficult. You don't want to recruit retired systematic reviewers, because they're going to be, you would if you could, but there are not many of them about. So perhaps you're wanting insight into what are the key questions, what are the terms you use. I'm using challenging behaviour as a recent example, which many people in, say, in dementia services know what challenging behaviour is. A lot of professionals in our area use the term BPSD. Which nobody in lay languages really uses very much. So getting a layperson's view, saying, well, make sure that you translate that into what it means. A lot of people say what examples of challenging behaviour are troubling to them. But there is a literature on that, and we don't. If you're commissioned to do a systematic review, you're not generally commissioned to do some qualitative interviews or anything like that. So we've found it still work in progress to think about how to involve lay people, older people, carers or whatever, in processes of systematic review. We would try and involve them maybe in the focusing what the subject would be, though often that's commissioned and so quite difficult to alter. We might say that we'd really like their help in disseminating a lay version of the findings, although they get terribly irritated with findings which are not much is known, more research is needed, please send check, which is usually what most findings of all systematic reviews are. And so I think we've got a lot to learn about how to work with people on that way. But it's a mutual rewarding activity, and sometimes you can say, yeah, we can't do the interviews, we can't do focus groups, we'll just spend some time showing you what it is we are doing, because it sounds like some mystical land, systematic reviewing. It is, of course, isn't it, if you're not a systematic reviewer, and so that's helpful. We've also found it quite difficult to think about how to involve people in the analysis of big data sets. Because big data sets are complicated, and before you know it, you're talking multiple regression and this sort of material and that sort of tests and so on and so forth. And people aren't always terribly interested in that. You could, of course, recruit a group of retired statisticians, which would be a lovely option. Usually they're not so available. But again, you might want to talk about what the findings mean in terms of looking at the big data set, and explaining perhaps people and asking them to help you with the glossary of terms, because we use certain terms very as a matter of shorthand, and perhaps they too can say, well, what do you mean by FTE? What do you mean by BME? What do you mean by NQSW or something like that? So assistance there. We struggle, and I don't think anybody's got it right about how to involve people in the really big data set analyses throughout that research. We have, however, found it really works well in comments on interview schedules, which can often be very non-lay language by the time everybody's commented on them in committee as a research team. You end up with an unwieldy question, and so you're often piloting it in a sense with people. We've found people thoughtful about approaches to recruitment, and we have been able to say to ethics committees who said do it this way, actually our consultation says that people don't think this is a good way to do it. So, for example, an ethics committee might want you to put up notices in a care home saying all interactions between staff and residents or patients will be subject to monitoring. If you have any complaint about this, please contact, and the print gets smaller and smaller. And you think, well, that's going to really put people off, isn't it? So to say, well, actually lay people have told us, put up a picture of a researcher and say, so-and-so is going to be researching in this home. If you've got any questions, I'll talk to matron, or whatever it is, something like that. So good, indefensible material. Our group, of course, gets absolutely apoplectic about consent forms, which from our college and required by many of our funders, run to 2 or 3 pages, have lots about no-fault compensation, and if you're injured by radiation and things like that, you're only going to interview somebody about their dog, and go on, and tell us time and again that these are not friendly documents. We listen and we say, we're stuck. We have a respectful, we're stuck conversation, and maybe they think they help us talk about things. We have worked with people who've worked with us in recruitment more directly, so held coffee mornings in care homes to explain what the researchers are doing in case relatives think we're part of the inspection or going to close them down or something like that. And that too has worked quite well. So quite a lot of charm offensive work there, using and publicising material. We've also, increasingly, I think, asked older people and carers and other lay representatives to be involved in the appointment of our researchers, which really changes the dynamics of something, doesn't it? If you say, well, it will be Professor so-and-so, somebody else from geography, somebody else from, research management or something, and a member of our older people's reference group. Some people don't turn up. They think, oh, that sounds a bit scary. Other people will sell themselves very well to that individual, and you'll get a sense of how they're going to communicate with your research group if they can not be patronising, not ask them if they take sugar, all those sort of things. So that's very good. And I think that's a very respectful way of involving people in the research. They've appointed the research assistant. They've had a full and frank discussion with us about, what their track record is, how they communicated with each other, with ourselves, and so on. So increasingly, we found that helpful, of saying this is about real involvement, and nothing is more real, is it, than actually getting the right research associate for the job or something like that, because you're really it's very difficult if you make the wrong decision. Again, we will talk with people about emerging findings, so that might be something that we've done with systematic review. Our emerging findings are more research is needed, all that sort of spinning it around. A small study in Iowa showed, those sort of emerging findings, which are often quite difficult to talk about. And then I suppose we've also said, and my increasing experiences having chaired a lot of advisory groups, is that they provide continuity, lay people, older people's representatives on such groups, because there's quite a high turnover in very big projects of staff and particularly support staff. So they are the only people who can remember what the project was about when it started, because there's been so much turnover. They can remember why site A was chosen, which appears balmy in retrospect, but they can remember all that, and they have an interest, and perhaps that is one thing that they really want to see, have the investment in something like, I'm using dementia as an example, because on a lot of dementia groups, they have a real interest in making sure things are right. It's not an academic interest to them, it's actually there. So I'm just about to start a project on handover in care homes. You know what I mean by handover? When the morning shift goes and the night shift comes and vice versa. And the people we're recruiting to be on the advisory group worry about that. They worry that their mum's bad day is not told to the night staff. Or they worry that their dad's interest in this and that he was, that he didn't want to shower is not told to the day staff or something like that. So great to have the continuity and the investment there, particularly because often if you're doing care home research, it's very hard to get care home lay representatives, because usually they're very ill, very frail, and increasingly in England they're lacking capacity to consent to those sort of activities. So what we did recently on a systematic review, here's a picture of a systematic review, as it often occurs to me. We did, however, have the resource, and this you can only do with a lot of money, to include some qualitative interviews to update and to supplement the literature findings. So we did do some work with that, and the older people were involved both as the participants of those, but also in helping us talk about the key or the killer questions for the interviews. We didn't want to ask people what sort of challenging behaviour you experience in dementia, because there is nothing new to add there, really. We wanted to ask them, our particular focus of the question is, what did professionals tell you could be done about it? And so we honed that question down. So we had to define professionals. We had to say, well, when we mean told you could be done, we mean a conversation with the nurse or the home care manager or the social worker and so on. Of course, our problem is when you get interviews, they tend to be terribly interesting and much more quotable than a small study in Iowa found, inconclusive data. That is not a quotable thing. So we do have to discipline ourselves not to get too excited about the human voice, because we really, really want to know what the big data is saying. And that, I think, is very important for the researchers and for the more experienced members of the team to just sit there and saying, particularly for junior colleagues, don't spend too much time on the qualitative stuff. You were commissioned to do a big quant study, because it is much more interesting to people to talk about human interest, isn't it? And you must, I think there's a cautionary tale there. So, being an expert by experience, that's a term often used, particularly in health settings now, and you see it used quite a lot in mental health, which has been very helpful in terms of turning that patient model around. It does suit some people. They are the expert by experience. They know what grand-sounding titles like intermediate care and reablement. Do you have that here? Yeah. What does it really mean? Somebody says, yes, they gave me a walking stick or something like that. People are big experts. People can talk very, very well about things that are not in the academic literature. So things like incontinence, very, very rarely features in a lot of academic literature, but people on their own will talk about it, will talk about what their friends have said about it. They're great sources of information, and they are experts by experience. We've found, of course, there is a risk of being too vague, and you have to have a sort of quizzical approach, really, to talk more about generalities. A lot of older people will talk about all older people, but they don't really mean all older people, they mean the people they know. And so it's a question of tying that in and saying, so you're saying that in your area this might be a particular problem, because it doesn't necessarily affect all older people. We're very careful in our group to have people who can talk about what it's like to live in a rural area. And they talk a lot about transport, as though transport is only a problem in a rural area. Everybody else can get a quick bus all over the place. And all the London people go up in arms because it's taken them 2 hours to get across London, and it's been quicker to come from the countryside. So you have to be careful about being vague, stopping generalities, stopping stereotypes, because everybody likes to say how awful it is in their own area. We're very conscious that there are outlier experiences. There are people who've had dreadful, dreadful experiences, and people who've had absolutely miraculously wonderful experiences. Both of them are probably not the norm. It's always a little bit more medley and a bit more muddly, isn't it? And just to be careful that that doesn't alter the dynamic of a group. If you've had a dreadful, dreadful experience and you talk about it in a group, it takes a lot of confidence for somebody to say, well, actually, for my mum, it wasn't so bad, because somebody's just told you all that dreadful, dreadful stuff. And that I think is important for the facilitator to perhaps note that it was an outlier experience, and for a really skilled facilitator to be able to stop somebody talking and to say, we'll pause there, we'll pick that up later, and have some debriefing. So again, experts by experience, so like the rest of us, can be very, very valuable, very, very hard to manage. And increasingly, I suppose, we're interested now in what people are talking about as proxy views, because so many older people, either end of life or in having really difficult disabilities, illnesses and so on, will talk on other people will talk on their behalf. There's some good studies now, particularly from the dementia area, saying that carers tend to overestimate the worst. They talk about how very hard it is for my mum, whereas actually when asked, and you can do it in some circumstances, the older person might say it's not that bad. So we're listening now a little bit more cautiously to proxy respondents. And there are difficulties, as you'll know, in social science about how to deal with proxies, because otherwise some voices are silent, but then you know that they're only proxy respondents. And as I've said, the skills of facilitators and meeting chairs cannot be underestimated. So I just thought I'd run through another example, which is a study we did of a disease diagnosis. The lay members of this group were hard to engage, partly because the people they were supporting, and it was usually carers, had this condition, and it fluctuated and it got worse and they got ill and they went to hospital, so we had difficulties in keeping that group going. Ideally, what we could have done was to have people who were former carers, so the person they'd looked after had died and so on, but then we would be talking about the diagnosis experience some 10 to 15 years ago, which wasn't really the one we wanted, so that was difficult. Our meetings became infrequent, they didn't get attended, it didn't seem to be a buzzy project, and the gaps widened as more and more of them became missed. And I think we learned a lot from that, to perhaps balance the group, to have individual phone conversations with people who couldn't meet meetings. But ideally on paper it sounded great. We would bring these people in, they would meet then, and it would all end wonderfully. It was hard and not as easy as people say. You'll all be familiar with this, won't you? I think this must have, has anybody ever read Arm Stein's paper? I'm sure some people have found it. Yes, George has. Once upon a time, you actually go and get the piece of paper, which must be one of the most quoted journal articles ever written in some obscure urban planning journal, isn't it? Anyway, she had this great idea, talk about impact, of creating a ladder of involvement, and a lot of people do it, still find it useful. I think it's useful. I know when things are a bit old, people tend to rubbish them. I think it's great. It works. What I suppose we're thinking now is that it's less linear. So if you can think of a non-linear ladder, sounds a bit of a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? Some sort of helix or something like that, or a snake and ladder that goes up and down. It's not all it does there. But it's amazing long-lasting. I think it works well, actually, in talking to lay people about seeing things as a ladder. We're at the early steps of involvement here, or we're really asking you to take key responsibility for this study, and sign up and get some money from it. So I'm very keen on the ladder, really. So what I wanted to think about was what the concluding routes for us gerontologists in particular. As I said, there are multiple routes and we don't get it right all the time. I like a standing group because I'm sort of that sort of person, and I think it has worked well, providing you think about it rather than seeing it as ever in a day. We also run lots of project groups, project per project, because not everybody is interested in some subjects, and a time-limited group is great. Sometimes they're sort of incubator sites. Somebody who's been involved in a project might come onto the bigger group, and vice versa. We think continuity is helpful because that allows people to have the confidence to be more critical friends rather than straight ambassadors, or not to challenge. And so that, I think, has been helpful. Discussions are minuted, but information remains within the group. And if somebody gives a PhD student a hard grilling, that isn't going to be splattered everywhere and won't get talked about. As I said, we're very keen on having one point of contact. I think that I find it very difficult in universities to know who's doing what. Certainly if you're an outsider, it's completely unintelligible. We like also to demonstrate the impact that people have, because you spend a lot of time, you've got up early, you've come to this meeting, you've had a rather indifferent sandwich lunch, and you're not going to get home till 9 o'clock at night. What impact did it make? So really in the minutes, feeding back, we did this as a result of that discussion. We decided to pause here as a result of those comments, or we altered this, telling people what happened. We like to name people in reports and websites if they want to be named, if not to then give them at least the group a mention. And our minutes are quite lengthy, so if you do miss a meeting, it is possible to get a flavour of it by doing it, so you don't feel you're totally disconnected. And in write-ups, we often mention people and what they said. Are people there as representatives of Cumbria's older people? No, they're there in a very personal capacity. They might like to tell you what happened to Cumbria Older People's Forum, but they're not there on behalf of things. So we don't have representatives on our groups from Age UK, Alzheimer's, whatever, unless we want them as the big voluntary sector group rather than individuals. And of course diversity at many levels is important, isn't it? We can think of the normal diversities of gender and geography and so on. We think class is a big unspoken diversity element, and you can't just say everybody on the group has got a PhD, because that's not a very typical older people's group, although one or two doesn't half help. So, what for funders then? Funders are very in favour of user care involvement, or PPI as the health service called it. I sit on some panels whereby the user or the lay audiences have absolutely the same voting rights as everybody else on that panel, even if they've got an ology or a list of scientific credits as much as anything. They have very much say, and they are peers there, and their views are valued. There are some variations of experiences. Some funders do see PPI as sending your findings to Age UK. Others are much more nuanced on that, so it does vary, and you need to think about it. Some will think an advisory group is enough. Others think co-investigators would be helpful. Other funders appoint, particularly the charities, appoint lay people to mind the project, their project prefects or mentors, and they keep a very good eye on your project because they've rattled cans and sat in custard to raise the money for your research, so they're really making sure it works, and they are a great resource as well. I talked about co-production. The most recent thing we did here was support our group of older people to do a study called, Not Just Grapes and Flowers, which was their interest in saying what happened to hospital visiting. They had heard, this was a group of people in one particular area who they heard from a lot of their sort of friends and contacts that hospital visiting was horrid, that people were sort of banned from the ward then and couldn't go there, and they couldn't take in grapes in case they contaminated the entire environment, and it was really sort of scary to do hospital visiting. They got a commission from the hospital to do a lay survey of how hospital visitors felt and presented it. Of course, that sounds great and it sounds doable, but it was our investment in that of helping people write up the report and things like that and making sense of it that I think made it a very good report. So this was an element of user control. They defined the problem, they argued for the money with a bit of help, and we think it recognised their assets and their priorities as well, and was quite good in building up social networks. Their roles and expectations were of course very high. They were going to change hospital visiting, if not in that town, probably in the universe, and that was hard to manage those expectations. But I think they did a very good job in an area that mattered to them. So here are the justifications that you're probably familiar with. It makes one more ethical research. It improves research design. I've argued that sometimes it's very helpful in recruitment and data synthesis, and it does help with user rights knowledge and interest there. Challenges, I've already summed up some of those. The tendency to involve the fit and the few, the able and articulate, hard to get people who live in care homes involved in that way. Activists have their own agenda, that's why you're an activist, isn't it? And it's important for them to be given permission sometimes to say what that is. Sometimes they can mirror the researchers, and so you don't get a lack of challenge, and I think particularly people who are retired professionals often mirror the researchers' profile and agenda and interests and lack of challenge. One of my most effective members who died recently had a job particularly that involved car parks. This was great. He brought an interest in car parks, which are very interesting, of course, to an area where I don't know anything about car parks. But that was a good way of thinking about users. It was a good way of thinking about difficulties, but it wasn't thinking about social work and social care. Although if you live in a university, you know that it is united by people in search of a car parking space. So had a great deal of commonalities. Managing inequalities I've talked about, and then and involving early, and particularly with a standing group, explaining why there won't be some projects that people have spent time thinking about and you've not got the money. You can't magic the project then if the money doesn't arrive. So being aware that there will be false starts. So with hindsight, what would I have done? I probably would have acted earlier to involve people more in job recruitment, job descriptions, even appraisal and promotion criteria. And I was said, promotion criteria should be demonstrable involvement of the user group in your research career, and seeing that as important. I probably would have tried to work out more specialist roles for people, particularly around those hard projects where it has been difficult to get user involvement, and less, I think, willing to say, let's give the money to this third sector group and they can sort it for us, because that often just involves another group of professionals. I think there's a curious lack in some universities between user groups and carer groups that help in professional training and then the ones that do research. And I'd probably have tried to marry those two together, because quite a lot of professional education courses have got really good groups going, but like most things, they keep a sort of ring around them and don't let anybody pinch or poach their members, and we may be involved in there. And then lastly, to say skills that I've talked about that we're requiring of people can be developed, and the shyest people, the people who aren't used to meetings, after a while I think offer really valuable insights, and very different ones from those that researchers have got. So I'm going to end there because I've prattled along enough. I'm very happy to answer questions and obviously to give you more examples if that would be necessary. But thanks ever so much for listening.